This is Dan Schneider, and on this Dan Schneider video interview, I will have the final installment of my three-part series on existence. Last month, I spoke with Bishop John Shelby Spong, a theologian. A few weeks ago, I spoke with Tyron Goldschmidt, a philosopher. And today, the man you see before you is an astrophysicist named Adam Frank, and I will begin my talk with him when we get back. Well, let me kick off this last installment of my series on existence. Adam Frank is the man before you, a physicist and astrophysicist, to be more specific. So, Adam, if you could take a few minutes and just discuss who you are, your interest in astrophysics, and what your main beliefs are, and any books or anything that you have out there.
I'm an astrophysicist at the University of Rochester. I also have a strong interest in philosophy of science and the intersection between science and culture. So I do a lot of popular writing for National Public Radio and the New York Times. I've written a couple of books, always with an interest on how the questions that science asks how they rise out of general cultural concerns of humanity, general foundational philosophical concerns of humanity. So my own research interests in astronomy focus on what's called computational astrophysics. So my group we build large computer codes, run them on supercomputers to study things like how stars form, how they die, how planets form, interaction between planets and stars. I also have a growing interest in what's called astrobiology and the evolution of life on other planets. I'm actually particularly interested in the evolution of intelligent species and technology, and how any species that develop technology will interact with its planet vis-a-vis the Anthropocene and what we're going through now. So I have, kind of too many interests in a lot of ways, yeah. Not enough time.
So I would take it when you talk about the Anthropocene, do you think that we just moved into a new period, or are we in a new era? Is this the Homozoic era, maybe?
Yeah, I think that question about whether or not you actually want to use stratigraphy, right, to actually identify the geological epoch or era that we're heading into is, one can focus on that. The point really is much more dynamic in the sense that if you can look at things like just the material transport, how much stuff human beings are moving around on the planet. We are now the dominant force compared to other non-human actors on the planet. So the Anthropocene is really it's much more about energy and entropy and things like that than whether or not you can identify a layer in the geologic strata. If it goes on long enough, we don't wipe ourselves out in 200 years, then yeah, there will clearly be a geological
with that sort of thing. And I was just looking at your book about time, cosmology and culture at the twilight of the Big Bang. When was that published?
That was probably 3 or 4 years ago.
So when you say the twilight of the Big Bang, are you saying that you think that science is moving beyond the idea of the Big Bang as the beginning of everything? Are you a multiverser?
No, actually, I'm not a multiverser. But the idea of that book is that one way or the other, we're now willing to start considering what I call the Wild West of ideas associated with what happened before the Big Bang, or whether you even need a before. It's that, in a variety of ways, particularly because of our explorations of quantum gravity, successful or not, people are beginning to explore alternatives to the traditional idea that, the universe began in the Big Bang. And actually, it's not even traditional, because really, in many ways, very few people ever believed that the Big Bang was the beginning of time. It was just that they sort of pushed that question back. And so the book is about two things. One is about the human experience of time and how it's been mediated by technologies, and how that and cosmology have just been completely interconnected. So in ways, whatever your culture's technology for creating time was, for marking it out, breaking up the day, actually shaped the kind of questions you could ask about what you thought the beginning or how cosmic time works. So, but what's happening now, we're in an interesting moment where we're sort of willing to consider a range of ideas, some of which are very radical, like the multiverse, that ask the question, what happened before t equals 0?
So yeah, and this gets to the idea of existence, because I know in my other interviews I was talking about, is existence really equal or equivalent to talking about life? But when you talk about the Big Bang, one of the things that always happens, when people think about it is, well, there had to be something, because it's sort of like the turtles going all the way down, or who made God? It's those kind of things. And so if there was nothing before it, is nothing really something? Because how can one imagine nothing? When we think of nothing, we think of blackness, but it's blackness. That's not nothing. And so
Right.
you run into sort of this ideational wall, and human beings have a big problem with those kinds of walls. Things like deep time that came with James Hutton a few centuries ago. It was hard to think of even 1,000,000 years ago, much less 1,000,000,000,
Right.
or to go out 1,000,000,000,000 years ago. Other things, deep time and nothingness are these things that are sort of beyond human ken, because they're so far beyond us. So when we talk about existence, are we just limited to the three physical dimensions and the temporal fourth?
Well, this is what's actually interesting now, is because you point quite rightly to the sort of limitations that human beings have had in thinking about beginnings of time, beginnings of the universe. And Marcelo Gleiser, I think, made a great point when he was looking at the role of mythology. I've also been very interested in mythological descriptions of the beginnings of the universe, and in my first book, I discussed that quite a bit. And what you see there is really, there's only a few options that people have for thinking about this, right? There's only a limited geometry of time. Like, either time is a big circle, so you just get an endlessly recurring oscillating universe. Time has a beginning and then an infinite flow outward, or time is just always infinite. And we really struggle to come up with anything other than that. And one wonders whether or not this is just fundamentally a limit of our imaginations, of sort of how our brains are constructed in a way of describing it. But the interesting thing, of course, about mathematical physics is it allows you to sort of at least attempt to push past the limitations, right? So just even the idea of 4 dimensions, right? If you talk to somebody before 1,000 years ago about a 4th dimension, it would be very difficult to even put into words. But once we started exploring, geometry, and then it started exploring non-Euclidean geometries as well, to start really playing with how dimensions can be curved, how space can be curved, you really started to open up a way of describing and exploring the consequences of things like having more than 3 spatial dimensions in a very concrete way. So I think many of the things that you're seeing happening in physics today are attempts to sort of use the mathematics and push the mathematics beyond what are the normal discursive limitations of the human mind. And what comes with that, though, the danger that comes with that, is people can start believing the mathematics is true when it may just be mathematics, right? And this is the great debate about string theory and the multiverse and what people now call, the possibility of a non-empirical science. That once you get past the data, if there's no more data to examine some of these questions, you just believe the math. And in some sense, the math can be a fantasy, beautiful fantasy, but it doesn't have anything to do with reality. So that's the sort of the 2 things you got to hold on to.
I was actually discussing with someone. I don't know where I was debating someone online, or I was just arguing with him. I don't know what you think, but let me just ask this in the realm of existence, because I was reading somewhere, someone was thinking about a pure mathematical universe where numbers could be real and what. And I'm saying, one of the things that frustrates me, I'm a writer, I deal with art and abstract ideas. Sometimes when I read sciences, most scientists are really bad with words, and they don't seem to know what the language means. To me, mathematics is always a metaphor. There is no pie out there. Mathematics is a metaphor for reality, and that's how we use. And I think that if there was some alien species, since you're in exobiology, or is it astrobiology, whichever you prefer,
Started.
Yeah, that if we were to encounter some alien intelligence, and I'm beyond the Star Trek Borg and all the humanoid stuff, but something really, like maybe if you ever saw the film Solaris, the ocean world, if we encounter, they would have probably a different mathematics. I don't think. Do you think that there could be a different mathematics or a different mind?
Well, this is the great debate, right? And this is really the great debate, that the fundamental question for theoretical physics, which stretches all the way back to Plato, right? So the Platonic, the dream of the Platonists was that this world that we see is just a corrupted version of an ideal world whose expression was purely mathematical. As the Pythagoreans said, all was number. That number was fundamental, and the relationships between number, that's reality. And this world is just kind of a crappy, version of it. And, the whole history of this metaphysical discussion has been, is that true or it's not true? Now, I'll tell you, my own history, right? I came to theoretical physics as a young man. I was interested in astronomy and science very young. And when I started learning about mathematics, I was enraptured. And this idea, like, that imaginary numbers. Like, what the hell is up with imaginary numbers? There is no square root of -4. What are you talking about? But, there's this imaginary number which actually becomes absolutely essential to so much of physics, particularly quantum mechanics. And then you think, like, wow, okay, these rules, these are part of the universe. They're not my rules. They're not in my head. We're discovering these rules built into the structure of the universe. And it's a very powerful idea. It's a very seductive idea. And there was that famous essay written by, now the name escapes me, by a famous physicist called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. So there are many who would argue that mathematics is actually, it's the mind of God, so to speak. That's metaphorical. But that mathematics is the actual structure of the world. And as physicists, we're discovering this skeleton upon which the flesh of the world is hung. And it's like I said, it's a very powerful idea. There's a lot of arguments for it. But as time has gone on, I am not convinced of that anymore. I am now more of the opinion that mathematics is, what we're seeing are the rules of the dialogue between us and the world. And I might argue that even for alien species, that any kind of consciousness might be patterned this way. Who knows? But certainly, I'm not a Platonist anymore. I started as a Platonist. Now I'm a lapsed Platonist.
Who was it that said time is just the thing that prevents everything from happening at once? Was that Einstein?
I'm not sure. That may be the Matthew effect, where somebody else said it, but it gets attributed to Einstein. But it might as well have been Einstein, right?
So let me just ask, since it's a basic tenet of a lot of people's idea of both mind and reality, are you a believer in the block universe? Do you think that everything is set there? Because to me, it's never really made sense that everything, from assuming the Big Bang, if it was, till a big crunch, that it's just all blocked out, and we just have this illusion. We're just sort of marionettes that are going through the motion. Are you a believer in that, or do you think that randomness and quantum uncertainty necessitates that we can know? I mean, we could have a good idea what's going to happen in an hour. In a week, it's a little less. In a year, it's much less. And in a millennia, who knows?
Well, the question here is really, what do we do with the mathematical structures that come out of theoretical physics, right? So the block universe is basically the four-dimensional space-time continuum of general relativity. And in that, it makes absolute sense, if you're working within general relativity, it makes absolute sense to consider things as being world lines or world worms, right? That your whole life, from your birth to your death, is a structure in this four-dimensional space-time, and your birth and your death are already there. Next Tuesday is already there, because that is the theoretical structure of general relativity. So the question is, well, is that real? Is that real? Should I take that as being real, or is it a convenient calculational tool? And this question goes all the way down to things like, well, what about electromagnetism, right? I mean, right now, you and I are talking to each other because electromagnetic waves are at some point flowing through, well, certainly they're flowing through fiber optic cables. Are those real? Are there actually, these mathematical, or is there a physical instantiation of those mathematical rules? So now again, I want to be careful here. Is that I'm a bit heretical in this, right? My views. That's kind of what I do. I've always in my becoming a lapsed Platonist, I've carved out a space where I'm a little more skeptical probably than the average physicist. So I think that the block universe is exactly that. It's a mathematical creation, enormously powerful. And that power really is going to take a lot of work philosophically to understand where that power comes from. But no, I don't think that is a reality existing out there in and of itself. We're talking about reality, right? So we've got to bring up the Kantian perspective.
Can I just interrupt you for 1 second before I get to Kant? When you say power, are you meaning physical power or are you meaning metaphoric, anthropological power?
Metaphorical power. Well, what's really going on, right? I can write down these equations. I can do derivations with them using the laws of mathematics. I get prescriptions that I can go out and make observations with and make predictions. And damn if those aren't true, right? If, all of the amazing technology that's allowing you and I to talk to each other is based on predictions coming out of these mathematical equations. So while I don't hold that, yes, these are the laws built into the universe itself, independent of us, you got to deal with the fact about how freaking powerful they are. So that's really got to be worked out. If you don't want to take the position that the block universe is the actual way the world is, then somehow you got to take into account, well, how does it work so well?
Back to Kant, you were making a point about Kant.
Yeah, because this, when I was in college, I was a young man in college. I took philosophy. Ran through the usual. I had a philosophy minor, and when we came to Kant, and then the phenomenologists, people like Husserl and Heidegger, that really changed a lot of my thinking, and the recognition that none of us have ever had an experience of the objective world, right? We have this thing called the objective world as part of our philosophical machinery, the world independent of us, the world that's going to be there after we die. It's a very powerful idea, and it's really what science is based on. But the reality is none of us have ever had an experience of that. We're forced to experience every aspect of the world from our perspectives, right? I'm always looking out through my eyes. And that really, when you really consider the reality of that, for me, it forces you to kind of reevaluate what you think is happening in science. So, the Kantian perspective that the thing in itself, as he would say, is unknowable. That we have these categories through which we just experience the world. I think I take that seriously. And I'm really interested in where that leads when it comes to thinking about science.
That would be like the brain in the pan or the brain in the vat kind of thing. We could never really know if we're just like, some 1950s schlock horror film and we're hooked up to or the Matrix to be more modern, the Matrix kind of effect.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, right? I mean, I'm not entirely sure that you could take the brain. I think, consciousness, now we're going to get into mind, right? That's a whole other issue. But I have a feeling that mind is very much embodied. So the idea that, and this goes, we can talk about artificial intelligence and whether or not, but that, consciousness only makes sense embodied in the world. So the idea that you can somehow remove it from the world and have it just be a bunch of electrodes without, I'm not sure that really works. I mean, that's...
So, I know. I was talking about that, I believe, in the prior interview with the philosopher, and in a couple of other interviews, I actually mentioned it too, the embodiment effect, that you can only really experience, you can have all the numbers you want, but like the HAL 9000 from 2001, A Space Odyssey, there's no way HAL could really engage the universe because, he has presumably the monitor that he can see and he can manipulate a little thing, but even he couldn't even manipulate the weather thing. Whereas if you have an Android, the Android, can feel, and we have Androids now that can pick up a single egg without squashing it. So, I know what you're talking about there. Let me just let's end this segment and I want to get back to a little thing about the block universe, because some years ago, maybe about 20 years ago, I remember I might have been arguing with a religious person. I'm always arguing, so I forget all my arguments. But and I remember talking about the idea of free will, and I think there is free will. I think it's rather obvious. I've always thought that most of what human beings do, experience in the world, is real, because we've evolved to. I mean, we evolved to this is a necessary thing. We have to know if the saber-toothed cat is up there, ready to pounce on us.
Right.
But the idea was that our lives, instead of thinking of ourselves as riding a roller coaster up and down, that we are the person riding the roller coaster. It's that an alternate idea that I've heard from some people, and I think it's interesting, is that we are not the riders on the roller coaster, but we are the roller coaster. Meaning that the Adam Frank is, the whatever it is, the thriller, or at Coney Island, and that just like in the old movie It's a Wonderful Life, we are that consciousness or whatnot is there, and anyone can experience the Adam Frank. There may be another consciousness experiencing Adam Frank when he was 17 and he had his first girlfriend, or when you were 6 years old and you skinned your knee playing baseball the first time. And I found that an interesting thing, because it a lot of people talk about the universe, or here on Earth, the Gaia hypothesis, or that the universe is somehow a living thing as well. And I was just wondering, I mean, this is, again, getting away from you as the physicist, but in your own, just as Adam Frank, a person, what are your own thoughts about things like that, in terms of, if you, I would say you're probably not religious, but if you were religious, or if you have your own philosophical view, what is your own personal view on something of that nature?
Well, I think that I am sort of rather famously on the books as being agnostic about the realm, about consciousness, about sort of what consciousness is. In particular, I've gotten into arguments with people about like what happens at death, right? And it's not like, I'm definitely not a believer in a soul that sort of transmutes, whatever. But just the idea of like, what is awareness? Where does awareness rest? And my, the biggest part of my agnosticism comes from the fact that like nobody knows, right? Until you die, then you'll find out. But having strong positions about the nature of consciousness, especially after death, is just a little ridiculous because there's no data. Nobody knows. Nobody's been there and come back and reported one way or the other. So it just sort of seems a little silly to take super strident positions. But I do, I think, I've done my thinking about the nature of mind. I take David Chalmers' hard problem idea seriously, that there is a hard problem associated with mind, and that I'm not a reductionist in that way. I think that there's, and then this goes back to my thing, my discovery of the phenomenologists, Husserl and Heidegger, and the people who followed from that in the turn of the 19th century or the 20th century, I think they were onto something. I think the idea that you really have to ask some of these questions from the inside, right? When we talk about the act of being a subject, right, which is so fundamental to us, Western science has had a very hard time with that, right? So we've made enormous progress in neuroscience, really fascinating things happening in neuroscience. But you can attach electrodes to my head all day long and watch me eat an apple and see which parts of my brain light up, but that's not going to tell you anything about my experience of eating the apple, my interior experience.
The qualia.
The qualia, right, exactly. And I think what we need to do is we need to come up with some methods, stable first-person methods for experimenting with that. And that's why, I've been doing, Buddhist meditation for the last 30 years. I wouldn't necessarily call myself a Buddhist. But contemplative practice is a really good idea. If you want to investigate consciousness, the one you have access to, is yours. The first person access. And so, I think there's stuff in there to be learned. Again, I don't necessarily. It would be absolutely fine with me if that the consciousness was just mental, neural activity, and when you die, end of story. That's entirely possible. But there's still a long way to go in understanding. Sort of, William James said, consciousness, the relation between consciousness and the brain, it could be either circuitry, which is our idea now. It could be more like an antenna, right? Or even said it could be like a trigger. So, there's a bunch of different ways you could sort of think about it. And we're just not anywhere close to knowing what the answer to it is, I would say.
All right, well, let's end this segment there. When we get back, we'll explore this a little bit further. Back with Adam Frank, and we're going to continue our discussion on existence. In your closing monologue there, it came to me, and I was wondering, is existence itself sort of a bit of immortality? And by that I mean, even if whether you believe in the block universe or not, we tend to have the idea that things that occur once they reach the past are somehow frozen. This is the idea of time traveling back to see dinosaurs, the famous Ray Bradbury story about stepping on something. But when I think if I've lived, at this point in time, I'm always getting married. At that point in time, I'm always playing a baseball game. When I'm 30 years old, I'm working at this job. I'll always be working at that job. I'll always be on, Wednesday 16th, 1983, doing whatever I was doing at that. Do you think that that is a correct way to look at it? Do you think that time sort of does freeze things in the past? And I don't want to get off on like the sci-fi thing of traveling back in time, but do you think that at a fundamental root, that given all the things that could exist and the meager amount that seems to exist, if it's not infinite, that if you exist, you are always there? When I'm saying that it's
right. Yeah. The question is whether or not you're a presentist or not, right? So, there's the philosophical position that only the present exists, or this idea that the past somehow, what is past is still, carries its traces of existence. There's a very interesting debate in the fundamental physics community now about the role of time in our equations, right? So time occurs in the different in the equations of physics in different ways. So in relativity, in GR, it becomes a dimension. It becomes part of the manifold, the space-time manifold. In quantum mechanics, it's just kind of sitting there as a parameter. So, there's been, and since, one of the great problems, the great problem of theoretical physics right now is to merge quantum mechanics and relativity. There's been one move in theoretical physics is to consider time to be emergent, that time is not fundamental, that somehow time, you had some timeless, or, that's not even maybe the word. And this is part of the problem, is how do we even speak about time if there's no time? But one of the problems, so one of the ideas is that there's some, there is the ground, the foundational ground of existence has no time in it. And time was something that emerged dynamically out of the interactions of the early universe. When we say, and again, even early, what does that mean? Yeah. So, but now, and that has led us into certain quandaries, right? And the multiverse, in some sense, you could say the multiverse emerges out of the need to sort of see time in a particular way. So, but then there's not, like recently, Lee Smolin has been pushing for the idea that no, we have to take time seriously. Time is real, history is real, and there's only one history, and we need to take it into account. So, this question of whether or not the past exists, you can add, I'll tell you what I think in a minute. But what's more important than what I think is more the different takes on it in theoretical physics. Because in many ways, theoretical physics is at a crisis now. So I just, I had a piece in the New York Times a couple weeks ago where Marcelo Gleiser and I were discussing sort of the weird state that theoretical physics is in now, where we've had almost 40 years where almost nothing we've done has managed to connect with reality. And it's not clear what the next moves are. So the Large Hadron Collider just turned on again. And if it discovers what's called supersymmetry, that's going to be great. And that's going to take us, maybe that may lead to a renewed emphasis on things like string theory and its attempts to merge space and time. But if it doesn't, and it's already eliminated some of the best options for what's called supersymmetry, then we're kind of in a weird position. And so we may need to look much more carefully at how we think about time. So, all right, so that's a theoretical physics background, and I can, we can talk about it more in a minute. For myself, I would consider myself a presentist, and I think this goes back to what I was saying before. All experience is grounded in time, is grounded in the now, in the emerging now. And I think that the past only exists for us in the way in which we remember it. I have to call the past into mind. I have to call my 6-year-old self into mind, or it's not there. So there is no 6-year-old self, And what's also very interesting is the way psychologically, your 6-year-old, you are who you are based on what you remember, right? If you're an angry person, it's because you have a lot of angry memories. When I was 6 years old, my dad took my, my favorite, Hot Wheels car from me.
Yeah. A philosopher named Mark Rowlands that I interviewed, a written interview, calls it the river of cells. The idea that like after every 4.5 to 7 years, depending on who you speak, every atom in our body is totally replaced. So as we're constantly shedding these little bits of ourselves, it's like a river. And I contain some of the water from the past, but it's all flowing towards something. But as you keep moving, you keep changing. So he calls it the river of cells.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting idea. And, so the thing is like I read a Zen teacher once said, anybody who spent any serious time meditating very quickly realizes the past and future are illusions. Now whether or not that's true of physics is a different thing. So, there's the eternal experience and but certainly I think even from a physics point of view, if I was looking for new theories, I would tend to look for things that were very much embedded in the now. The now is this sort of membrane, so to speak, of where existence is actually manifesting itself, and the past and future are potential, in some sense, and working that out is a difficult, an interesting question.
I know just a brief comment on the multiverse kind of thing. I've seen people have had like a few people have between 4 and 9 different types of multiverse. One being that the universe is so grand, what's over what we can't see, what light hasn't gotten to us. Those are sort of little island universes. There's a few others, and the most famous one is that every quantum choice brachiates off into another universe. But I mean, given all of what we have, and we'd have an almost infinity of universes every millisecond. And I've always found that kind of silly because even if we live in some in this room that I am, if this is all that is, and the universe is the smallest, our universe is the smallest atom bracket, we'd soon fill it up. Where is all that energy coming from? Because to make another, to split, you and I in our universe, where is that energy coming from to make a completely different universe all the seconds? So to me, just on a physical kind of energy idea, that totally fails. But I want to get back to your idea about emergent time, because the two things that for a layman like myself, that the word emergent is linked with is first the emergent life, that life, there's a lot of biochemical processes that happen on the Earth or possibly elsewhere, and that life just sort of emerged as a self-sustaining biochemical process, and it went from there. And then, of course, however many millions or billions of years later, depending on how you want to define consciousness or sentience, consciousness became emergent. So the thing that would be asked about time is, it would have to, I think, if it's emergent, emerge from the complexity of something else. So what is the stew from which time would emerge? Or am I off on that?
Oh, well, it actually emerges, do you mind if we wind back a little bit? Because the idea, though, we're talking about the multiverse in particular, and it's important because if you're talking about existence, right, how does physics describe existence? And everything, all of this comes back to quantum mechanics and the problems with the interpretations of quantum mechanics, right? So let's think about this for a minute. 100 years ago, physicists discovered that the atomic world, which you don't get a direct view of, you only get a view from setting up experiments and looking at dials moving back and forth. That the atomic world had a very different set of rules than the classical world, the world that we're used to, the world that we directly experience. And so they developed this mathematical formulation called quantum mechanics, to describe it. It's a set of rules that tells you, how systems behave and what happens when you measure them. And the amazing thing about these rules were that they are the most powerful theoretical tools we have ever developed. I mean, they give us accuracy in our predictions down to like 1 part in a billion. On the other hand, nobody knows what the hell they mean, right? Nobody knows how to interpret what these rules are telling us about the world. They can't give us, if I said, okay, what's an electron? Great, that's great, you got these rules, but what does an electron look like? Quantum mechanics was like, one time I asked my professor, what is an electron? And he said, an electron is that to which we ascribe the properties of an electron, which sort of tells you the problem. So for the last 100 years, people have been inventing interpretations of quantum mechanics, right? And there's probably like 1,000 different interpretations of quantum mechanics. And many of them, hinged on measurements. The problem we have, what we call the measurement problem. Because, I have equations to describe a quantum system before I look at it, and then when I look at it, when I make the measurement, something weird happens. The equations are suddenly abrogated. We have to stop using those equations and something else happens. So there's been like a range of interpretations, and the many worlds interpretation that you're talking about is one of them. And it says that every time I make I make a measurement, the universe splits off into all the different possibilities that measurement might have had. And if that sounds weird to you, it should sound weird. That shows you how much trouble we're having interpreting quantum mechanics. The Copenhagen interpretation says reality places, and they're all potential. And so, the famous Schrodinger's cat example is that inside the box, the cat is dead and it's alive. And you're like, well, that can't be. Those are opposites. You can't be dead and alive at the same time. So every interpretation of quantum mechanics comes up with some kind of mental gymnastics, some kind of mental yoga, especially in terms of what it does metaphysically to the world, to try and deal with those consequences. So when it comes to existence, and when it comes to, for me also, mind, until we really understand what matter is, until we have an interpretation that's been validated experimentally, we're kind of on a really interesting, shaky ground.
Yeah, it reminds me, it seems very similar to what writers and people who deal with language talk about the failure of language, because all language is ultimately circular. And so if I say, oh, look at that red apple over there, and I parse down the sentence, even if I just say red apple, well, okay, what is red? Putting aside even the qualia issue that was mentioned before, and what is an apple? Well, red is a color that is like most apples, or like a stop sign, and an apple is a fruit that is of the so-and-so family. But well, what is a fruit, and what is the so-and-so family? And so you get that, and so that's what's called the failure of language. Now that theoretical idea that all language would fail, using that sort of like all the dominoes going back in an endless circle, knocking each other down, Noam Chomsky came up with the idea that as we've evolved, emergent, that the mind, we sort of just know these kinds of things, that it's hardwired into us through millions of years of evolution, and so that's why language doesn't fail, because we can look at an apple as a child. The first time we ever see an apple, we can smell it, we can bite it, we can see it, and we know apple. Apple is that thing, and we don't even think of it as that the word is a metaphor or
right.
Something equivalent. So is there something, do you think, that on a deeper level than even language, that there is sort of this Chomskyan built-in thing, whether it's into sentience or into something else in the universe, that makes perhaps meaning, if you want to talk about it, or the meaning of existence, or existence, something possible, that like the failure of language being seemingly abnegated by Chomsky's ideas and discoveries, which have now been generally accepted. Do you think there's the Chomskyan idea for existence itself, why there's something rather than nothing? Do you know what I'm saying?
Well, I think that I'm not up on. I haven't read Chomsky very much, so I wouldn't want to comment on that. But the question about whether or not So really what you're talking about here is the emergence of self-consciousness. What happened in that, the Big Bang of consciousness that they talk about 70,000 years ago when we suddenly started symbolically representing ourselves in the world? And I think, this failure of language speaks to something that's also relevant to physics as well, which is that, and to what we're talking about with the Kantian idea, which is that, we don't have direct experience of the world. We don't have some unmediated experience of the world. That part of what self-consciousness does is it selects out parts of experience and then puts a conceptual saran wrap around it, right? So I point at this thing and say, that's a computer, right? And it's sitting on a table, and the table is on a floor. But on some level, from a quantum field theory point of view, it's all fields. It's a continuum of fields. The table is an arrangement of atoms sitting on another arrangement of atoms, but there's not necessarily, the boundaries between them are, I think, not as clear on that level as they are conceptually. So we had to, in order to develop self-consciousness, we had to play this game of separating one thing from another. Right, and giving them names, right? That's what, I love the idea in the Bible that, God gave name to all the animals, right? That was an important thing. In the beginning was the Word, right? So,
well, I think God let Adam and Eve do the naming, and I think He granted them that wish, I believe.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm just remembering the Bob Dylan song, God gave name to all the animals. But certainly, logos, the idea that, in the beginning was the Word, the idea that is so essential. I think we should take very seriously, both in physics and in thinking about self-consciousness. Because, Nietzsche talked about the idea that the world on its own was just flux. It's just unmediated flux, right? And I think I've always thought that was kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. Clearly the world is out there, right? There's no doubt that there's a world out there. But what its structure is independent of us that's the really interesting question, right? So in some sense, it all comes down to that old question of if a tree fell in the forest and there was no one around to hear it, would it make a sound, right? I think that's actually that is the core question when it comes to a lot of this stuff.
Picking up on what you said, you talked about string theory, and there's always the classical idea that at the very bottom of things, whether you go to molecules, to atoms, to quarks, to whatever might be below, maybe small marbles or string theory, do you personally think that there is a bottom level to reality, in the sense that at some level there's no way you can penetrate anymore, or like that sci-fi movie, The Incredible Shrinking Man, you're just going to shrink into another Horton Hears a Who universe?
Right. Well, there's certainly, from quantum mechanics, the interesting thing just in that picture is that at some point space-time has to become quantized. Right? I mean, so, we sort of have this thing that, everything's smooth and you can just shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink. But at some point, reality itself has to break up into chunks, right? So there's just that idea in itself. And, reality itself, space-time itself. So as the incredible shrinking man, if he's occupying space, at some point, I guess, he would have to become trapped in a bubble of space-time. Because the one thing we've learned is the world on a space level is quantized. But, speaking to that question, more broadly, the question is reductionism as well, right? Does that ground level determine everything that happens on the higher levels, right? Does everything supervene? I think that's the correct philosophical term, on the ground level. And I'm definitely not a reductionist. I think that in emergence, there are philosophical problems with the idea of emergence, but it's been very popular with people like Stuart Kauffman and thinking about the emergence of life and the role of evolution. And I'm sympathetic to the view that as complexity, or as you climb up the levels of order, that new rules emerge that are absolutely not in the bottom level, right? That if I knew everything about atoms, I would not know about evolution, right? Because it's not in there. It's not, we always play this game, well, if you're God and you have God's computer, you could calculate, exactly what's going to happen. And I don't think that's true. I think that actually it's possible that the universe is creative, that when you get to higher levels, entirely new rules emerge that just were not in the lower levels. And that's true from life to economies, to life to self-consciousness to the development of economies. So, yeah, so I think, is there an absolute ground level? I'm not sure it matters, because the question is, what do you want to do with it? Is there a level at which there's no more structure or below it? Certainly, if we believe quantum mechanics, there will be a level at which reality breaks up, it becomes discrete, and then we'll have to ask, what are the rules between those quantum chunks? So in that level, in that way, I think there probably is a bottom level with rules at the bottom level, but that wouldn't on its own describe everything that goes on above it.
Yeah. Let me just end this segment on this sort of little arc. And in art, I often get into arguments with people about objectivity versus subjectivity. And I'm an objectivist. That doesn't mean that I think my answers or opinions are always right. But a lot of people say, well, this could be good, that could be good. If you're trying to say 2001: A Space Odyssey and Plan 9 from Outer Space, they're just equally good films. I mean, that's patent nonsense. And I would say, objectivity and subjectivity, for something to be subjective, everything has to be subjective, in which then everything doesn't matter. But one objective fact objectivize the universe because you can then parallax anything objectively from it. And so it's like having a whole Pacific Ocean of pure water. You drop one little bit of blood in it. It might take 10,000 years to thin out, but the Pacific is no longer pure. And so I also then will often talk with people about the idea of truth versus reality. And, I'll say there's an obvious difference between truth versus reality. Reality is that Dan Schneider is interviewing Adam Frank via Skype. The truth, or not truth, is the statement. Dan Schneider is interviewing Adam Frank via Skype.
Right,
That's the truth or reality.
Yeah.
So my question is, given the objectivity, subjectivity, truth versus reality, do you think that in the cosmos there are just because answers, that everything is ultimately knowable, or there are going to be some things that are beyond human ken, or beyond any super being or whatnot is beyond the ken of that, and could, getting back to objectivity and subjectivity, could some other creature's reality, maybe a creature that lives on a neutron star, be just as valid in its own sphere as ours is?
Yeah, I think, because any statement about the world is necessarily incomplete. I mean, so the idea that, for me, experience is primary. That's what comes first. It's the experience of the world that is true. Like you said, that's what you were calling reality. And this is where I get into arguments about, sort of the limits of science with people. Are there limits of science? Yeah, absolutely. In the sense that, any statement I make is a statement. It's just a bunch of words, a bunch of symbols. And this is true of religion too. Religion is the same thing. How can any religious text be the ultimate truth? I mean, what is most important about being human is that we are experiencing subjective beings. That's what matters. That's the truth. And then we try and codify things. But no statement will corral all experience. So yeah, in that sense, I think that we have to see experience as being primary.
Yeah, and so I would take it then you're a materialist then.
That I am a materialist? Yeah. No, I'm not a materialist at all. I'm a phenomenologist. I do not think that the world is just material, because what matters. I'm starting from experience. I say that what I know is my experience of the world. I know, so that is what is primary. Right? So how that fits in with what exists, that's a long, interesting discussion.
So to a lay person listening to you, you make that difference. You're not necessarily then a believer that all things are reducible to that ultimate little marble. You are more of the view of that there are relationships, perceptions that cross weave, and that is when you talk about phenomena. Or if you could explain that to for our lay person.
I'm a radical agnostic and all that. I'm a scientist. I think the idea when it comes to these ultimate questions of taking hard positions is ridiculous, right? Taking a hard position, a strident position about how stars form, great, do that, But taking a strident position about the fundamental nature of reality and mind is why would you want to do that? First of all, it's no fun because nobody knows, and it's the beauty of being alive is this weird thing we're part of. So to take a strident position and say I am this or I am that is sort of, that's why I say I'm not a Buddhist, right? What I understand about Buddhism, look, it's all about the experience, it's the exploration that matters. So I think a lot of my role in the role I take is often to say, like, look, your humanity is certainty. The idea that you're taking a position where you have absolute certainty about something makes very little sense, especially when it comes to ultimate questions, right? So I do not believe the materialist position that all there is matter. That's it, and everything emerges out of matter. I don't take that position, A, because of quantum mechanics, because now explain to me really what matter is, right? In lieu of having a validated interpretation of quantum mechanics, I don't know what an electron is, so it makes no little sense to be a materialist. You can then say, well, are you a physicalist, right? Do you believe that all that exists in the world is physical? Well, then you got to define what physical means. But even there, I'm going to be a little agnostic about it because I'm, again, this idea of the observer, of subjectivity. I take subjectivity seriously. So it may be that there, as some people have suggested, maybe you need a consciousness particle. That's very crude to put it that way. But until I really know what consciousness is, I'm not going to say, oh, consciousness has no role whatsoever, no fundamental role in the universe. So so that's why I'm saying I'm a radical agnostic.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the last century we've gone from thinking that only mankind was blessed with consciousness to now acknowledging great apes and then whales and crows and even cats and dogs. And I for example have grave doubts about the old recognizing oneself in the mirror, because to a cat or a dog it's just another cat. I mean I see my cat slough me off if he doesn't want to. I've got cats and they're not interested. They're not interested. So they look in the mirror. They're like, oh, that's just another cat. Fuck him.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So, but I want to just because you brought something up. I was looking up on your book, The Constant Fight: Beyond the Science and Religion Debate, and just to get I did a show a few months ago called The Visionary of Fraud, where I had two pro and con Richard Dawkins people arguing, and I'm not a big Richard Dawkins fan, although I enjoy his. I enjoyed some of his books, and I his idea of the meme and selfish gene are interesting things. Ideas. I've always found he just seems to butt his head up against the same wall, arguing the same things with the same people. So from what reading, it seems you're not a big fan of that science that I'm just going to pound my view into, because to me there's very little difference between a theist and an atheist, which is why I'm an agnostic. So
I find Richard Dawkins. I mean, the new atheists, they played an important role, I think, in sort of pushing back, especially in the United States, against the rising tide of political influence of religious fundamentalists. So I'll give them that. But I think that position that like anybody who is spiritual has a sense of human spirituality, or even wants to lead a life that has a religion plays a role, to call them all just idiots and you're a moron, it's just, first of all, it just doesn't help anybody, right? And it basically just plays to the audience. It plays to the too highly polarized audience, sucks all the air out of the room, and leaves out the really interesting conversations that can happen between people who sort of interpret the world or interpret their experience in terms of however you want to broadly describe it. In terms, in that book, I really focused on the word sacredness, because it's not sacredness is actually connected with Roman temple architecture and has nothing to do with any particular religion at its root. But there are people who want to interpret the depth of their experience through that, and they love science. They think science is very cool, and they're willing to to engage with it. So to say anybody who does that and also has some spiritual sensibilities or religion is an idiot. Like, what's the use of that? So, Dawkins' approach I don't find very useful.
All right, on that note, we'll end this segment, and when we get back, we'll continue the conversation with Adam Frank. I'm going to end this interview with a final question, and then I'll let Adam Frank have a couple of minutes just to sort of declaim on whatever he wants to declaim on. In the very first interview that I did with a theologian, I started this series asking a question based off of pop culture. Back in the 1960s, there was a very great sci-fi intellectual show called The Prisoner with an actor named Patrick McGoohan. And it was basically about a guy who seemingly resigned as a spy. He's captured by who knows what, put on an island with a lot of other prisoners. He tries to escape every episode for 17 episodes, one season. He fails. There's one particular episode called The General, and in that it had a typically 1960s room-sized computer, you know, sort of like the Colossus, the Forbin project kind of thing. And the computer could answer any question. It was revolutionized how children were taught in England and beyond, blah, blah, blah. Village, number 2, who is the great nemesis, is spouting off to number 6, played by Patrick McGoohan, and saying, this will revolutionize the world. It can answer any question, blah, blah. And at the end, when it's revealed what the General is, this giant room-sized computer, McGoohan, as number 6, goes to the keyboard or whatever and just 1, 2, 3. He types in a letter, and the computer, it starts fritzing, overloading, whatever, goes on fire. And number 2's in a panic. Said, "What did you do? What did you say? What did you ask it?" And he goes, "WHY," which is ultimately the question of existence to me. Is, you know, is there an answer to even that kind of a question? Why something rather than nothing? Why anything?
I think that question does not have an answer. You know, I mean that there's the brute facts of existence, and you know, I could say it's all love. It's all love. You know, that's why. Your cat, talk to your cat. Your cat will tell you. You know, your cat says, "Look, pet me." Okay, that's the reason for existence. Yeah, I just don't think that is the why question. And I think about that all the time. Like, who ordered this? You know, whose idea was this? Especially when you look at, you know, with human life, all the suffering that goes on that we have to deal with. You know, even, you know, in the midst of, you know, the wealth that most of us or many of us have in America, we still all suffer. So it's like, so I really think that the universe, that's one of the great discoveries of science, is that the universe could care less. You know, I mean, there's meaning. We bring meaning into the universe, right? And I think that's actually an important thing. I don't think the meaning we bring into the universe is trivial. But on the other hand, the universe itself could care less. And that's a beautiful thing, right? There's the brute fact of this existence, and it plays out. And I think, you know, we can invent mythologies for it, but in the long run, it is the great mystery, the great unanswerable mystery.
Yeah, I've often said that to other people too. I've said the only thing that I pretty much am certain of is that if there is a secret or a meaning to life, it's that every individual can bring meaning. That's the ultimate power that we have. I mean, we can't, you know, maybe at some point we could become immortal beings or something. I don't think it's going to happen in the next 20 or 30 years like a Ray Kurzweil thinks.
Yeah.
But we bring meaning. I mean, it may be small meaning in some instances. In other ones, it might be Einsteinian big meaning. Even if everything he believes got overturned, it still helped bring forth that overturning. But that's my opinion. So let's wrap up this interview. If you just want to take a couple of minutes and just, if you want to state anything about any of your beliefs, or if you have anything coming up, you know, with any books or anything else that you want to talk about.
Well, you know, okay, so let's talk about something about meaning and about something that's completely different. So I told you, we started the interview and I told you I'm starting to do this work about the what I call the astrobiology of the Anthropocene, right? So I'm just working on a paper now where I'm trying to calculate the minimum probability below which we are absolutely alone in the universe. We are fundamentally, there has never been another sentient species in the history of the universe. And I think I can do that. It's actually pretty simple. But most likely, and that number turns out to be something like 10 to the minus 21, right? So if you believe that the probability for evolving an intelligent technological species is greater than 10 to the minus 21, then this has happened before, right?
Using something like the Drake equation.
Yeah, exactly. We modified the Drake equation. We have what we call the A form, the archaeological form of the Drake equation. And so, even if you're very pessimistic and you think that, oh, the universe, you need a billion planets you have to go through before you get one that gets intelligence. That still means that's, 10 to the minus 1 times 10 to the minus 9, that's 10 to the 12. That's still, a trillion, it's a trillion times this has happened before. A trillion, if you think life once every billion planets, you get a species that evolves all the way up to our point. That means it has happened, a trillion times in the history of the universe. And in that sense, meaning may actually be important, right? Meaning may have been, every time one of these species pops up and begins looking at the universe and asking questions of it and developing, its artifacts, its symbolic representations of itself, that really may actually, and then, actually manipulating the world, right? So I love science fiction. I read it as science fiction. So, Dyson spheres and, who knows? Like, who knows how far it goes? But I think that intelligence and technological intelligence, tool-making intelligence and the symbolic representation that requires may actually play a larger role in the universe than, maybe we've thought about before. So, I don't know. I'm not really sure what to do with that. But I find it startling to think about how many times this may have happened and what each each instance of it may imply.
Just if I were to ask you to make a bet and say, just give me a percentage of the chance of probability, do you think that in the next 100 years we will find life in the universe, at least in our solar system, on one of the moons of Saturn or Pluto or wherever?
Well, actually, I think even better, forgetting about our solar system, the atmospheric characterization of exoplanets means that in the next 100 years, 200 years, we're going to be able to really do a good job of understanding what's going on in all these planets, at least, in terms of chemical disequilibrium. So I think, yes, within the next 100 years or so, we'll have evidence that there's life, there's other biospheres. And again, with our own solar system, yeah, there's some really interesting things going on there, but I'm even more interested in the terrestrial exoplanets and the Earths and super Earths that we're discovering. I think that's going to be the place we're going to find some pretty interesting evidence.
All right. Well, I want to thank you, Adam Frank, and that is the wrap-up of the third of my 3 shows on existence with a theologian, a philosopher, and a physicist. Next week, I'll be switching gears. I'll be talking about history. And it may be a show on several historians, or it may be one on Oswald Spengler. But regardless, that should be interesting as well. So thank you, Adam.
Take care.